Hello there! Greetings and salutations. It is just harder than Satan's jockstrap out there. It simply is. A lot of questions keep coming up in live stream. Here's a neat book. It's called Natural Philosophy by Deschanel. This is, I think, 1867 publication. I have to read a quote out of that in a second. Kill two birds with one stone, as the old saying goes. By the way, there's an ancient famous quote from Nikola Tesla. Said, the secrets of the universe, you need to think in terms of frequency, energy, and vibration. And ironically, two of those mean exactly the same thing. Like saying runny, wet water, which of course basically all three of those refer to the same thing. And this video is really about duality, but also too defining electricity, and also too emanationism. Humanity is deep in the dark when they think about dualities, and there are no dualities. There's an irreducible simplicity in nature, and nature does not have any dualities, a duality implying an inherent contradiction. What electricity is incredibly simple. Defining, the assumed duality of nature, like this idea that North Pole and South Pole are a duality, of course, is completely ludicrous. It's ridiculous to think that there's a head side of a coin which is autonomous from a tail side of the coin, that science and metaphysics are two different things. Specifically, a stamping, be it gold or silver, is a modulation or a disturbance, an imprinting upon a medium, that medium being gold or silver. A frequency or a wavelength, of course, is a modulation of a different type of material, which is immaterial itself, i.e. the ether, because a field is nothing other than an ether perturbation modality. So all frequencies, of course, are a set cyclic imprinting upon a medium. And to say frequency, to say modulation is no different than really to say imprinting, because an imprinting is a disturbance or modulation upon the silver gold which is imprinted upon. Human beings love to complicate things. The more wisdom one has, the greater it becomes obvious that you can see the forest for the trees. Most people are looking at the trees and the bugs and the creepy crawlies at the base of the tree. They can't see the forest. They can't see, the big picture of anything. And that typifies most of humanity, unfortunately. So I'd like to, in a very roundabout way, as much as you can do in about 20 minutes, simplify emanationism. Also, too, electricity and this idea of duality. By the way, emanationism, the ancient Greek, the word for it is prohodos. It kind of literally means to go forth, but it is not the religion, but the metaphysics of the Pythagoreans, the Platonists, Neoplatonists, Proclus, Iamblichus, Numenius, Syrianus, on and on and on and on. And it's the complete opposite of atomism / nihilism, and also, too, the complete opposite of creationism, any belief system vis-a-vis religion. And these two antinomies are exactly the flip side of the coin. The middle, the opposite of both, is emanationism. And what people believe is none of my concern. I'm interested in addressing the root metaphysics of Pythagoreanism, but also, too, eliminating out this idea of duality. By the way, this book was published in this is the 6th edition. I think this is 1867 published. 1887, excuse me. Nothing has changed since the 6th edition of this book from I'm getting old, I need bifocals. Yeah, I folded the page here. This is a really, really big, heavy book. Nothing has changed today since 1887, 6th edition of this book. A field of force is any region of space traversed by lines of force, or in other words, any region pervaded by force of attraction or repulsion. A magnetic field is any region pervaded by magnetic force lines. All space in the neighboring of the Earth, magnetic field, moderate distance, blah, blah. Of course, this is 1887, so we forgive them, for making those errors. This is no different than the speculation actually dreamt up, even in ancient days, in ancient Greece. And here's interesting, this book, even though it's absolutely super huge and it was reprinted over and over and over and over and over again, say, well, that's old time, I forget when the first edition with this was, like 1867, I believe. But right here on page 548 talks about the duality of electricity. A lot of scientific, intelligent scientific, not modern day scientific, which is not intelligent, made scientific observation. We talk about the duality of electricity. Doing a super simple experiment over here, they take an electrified rod that's actually been rubbed. They would call it electrified, but it's actually electrostatics. They would make note that duality seems, electricity seems to have two principles, one of attraction and repulsion. So they would talk about also too on magnetism. Let me actually read from this book. It's actually a very brilliant observation, because magnetism, of course, is just the dielectric field. Magnetic fluid, they have no idea what magnetism was then. Of course, none of these people today do either. All mutual forces between magnets, blah, 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 blah. Between different portions of two imaginary fluids, one which may be called positive and the other one called negative. There's this suppositions about magnetic polarity being not literally fluid, but fluidic. Neither fluid can exist apart from the other. So even they knew, even though there was a dual nature to electricity and dual nature to magnetism, and of course ultimately we were conjoined with electromagnetism, but everything about electricity is misunderstood today, and this was understood by a man far more brilliant than Nikola Tesla. That was Charles Proteus Steinmetz, who even said electrical discharges, waves, and impulses from his 1917 book, that electricity was the hybrid modality working in conjunction between dielectricity and magnetism. If you actually understand what electricity is, which is this hybrid energy circuit of dielectricity and magnetism, explaining an electromagnet becomes incredibly easy. An electromagnet actually dumps the dielectric, leaving an extremely powerful magnetic pulse. This is how an electromagnet works. But talk about a negative charge, too, which is completely ludicrous. And even growing up, before realizing Russell and all these other greats that I had looked into, he said it was ridiculous to talk about a negative charge, but that exists today. Also to so-called magnetic attraction, which does not exist. That's not magnetism at all, that's rather dielectric acceleration. A negative charge, and in kind of a humorous way I thought about making an analogy for people, would be like, say I'm eating my cheesecake, which I had the other day, which I know I shouldn't be eating because I'm fat, right? Like if I ate my cheesecake and the plate was empty, and I were to say to somebody who saw me eat the cheesecake, it's like, here I have negative cheesecakes. Like, what the hell are you talking about? Well, look, you show me a plate, not that I'm introducing the plate as anything. Like, here I have negative cheesecakes. Like, no, you ate it all. It's just completely ridiculous to talk about a negative charge. Instead of saying negative charge, we should say discharge, locus, or ground. By the way, you know what they call a duality? Of course, there are no dualities in nature in electrical theory. They call it electricity or a circuit. An electrical circuit, you need to complete the circuit for something to work. That's not a duality, it's a principle and attribute. The principle behind emanationism is abundantly clear. There is no, of course, original cause or first cause, prima causa, as it is in Greek, or original sin, as there is in creationism, rather principle and attribute. Principle and attribute are not a duality, nor are they a pair, nor could they be a pair. Light and illumination is not a duality. The good and the good, in English, unfortunately, there's no term for the extrinsic attribute of the agathon or the absolute, so we say the good and the good. One is a principle, and the other one, of course, is the attribute. Attribute, of course, is modulation or disturbance, and it, of course, the character for something. And this is the reason for and the premise behind all beauty in nature. And it is a harmonic sympathy with the one. In other words, it is a perfect harmonic sympathy in modulation, in extrapolation of the attribute of the one. Not destructive interference, which of course would be that which is ugly or not beautiful. And of course, nature abhors, people say, nature abhors a vacuum. Actually, nature abhors an absence of sympathy to the one. Life cannot exist without that sympathy. And things that are ugly this is not me saying it, this is nature saying it, not that nature has a voice or consciousness, eliminates out things that are not harmonic or sympathetic to or with the one. And of course that which makes life possible is water. And the perfect harmonic sympathy of the golden ratio, the only perfect geometry in the entire universe, is that 108-36-36 isosceles triangle, or 1-1-phi triangle, which is also too the geometry of water, which is necessary for life to exist, but I've talked about that endlessly in other locations. The Greeks referred to this extrinsic attribute as the euristos dias, incorrectly translated as indefinite dyad, also to tolma, or ananke, which is crudely translated as necessity, but what it means is it can't exist any other way. If people were to sit and think, if they actually want to know the secret to the universe, they need to understand duality and eliminate it out from their head. People say, well, evil is the inverse of the good. No, evil is not something inverse to the good, nor is a shadow the inverse of light. The shadow is an absence of light. Ignorant people and children do evil. True evil, which would make somebody demonic, is of course the love of evil. It is that which is directed away from the one. But that doesn't make it an inverse to light or the one. Rather, the willed vis-a-vis ignorance or willing towards evil, which of course when one knows the difference and they will towards evil, then they are of course by definition demonic. Not from any Judeo-Christian standpoint, but from a metaphysical standpoint, when one knows the difference and one wills towards that. This is what is true evil, is the love of evil and doing evil willfully. One can ignorantly do evil without will, without conscious forethought. It is still an evil and something horrible and directed against the one, but it is not done willfully, with consciousness, of course. So light and illumination, principle and attribute, but principle and attribute are a holos, so one thing. There's not a head side of a coin and a tail side of a coin. People need to think about electricity. Everything within nature, magnetism and dielectricity. Magnetism is the extrinsic attribute of dielectricity, loss of energy or inertia. Everything that humanity calls magnetism is exactly dielectricity, except we refer to it in reference to loss of energy or inertia. Literally, the centrifugal force vector that it is voluminous creates space. When you have mass and magnitude, you have its measure, which is space. When this is present, that is present. Dielectricity, of course, terminates in counter space, but dielectricity terminates into counter space as magnetism, that loss of energy or inertia, the magnetic field, i.e. the toroidal geometry, which reciprocates the three-dimensional force vector that makes up the toroidal field, literally a three-dimensional S-curve. I don't know why everybody keeps asking me about magnetic pole flipping, but that's perfectly natural, by the way. It's called the Lamore frequency, or gyromagnetic precession. There is literally torque and phase when magnetism exists. The Earth has shown through magnetic rock strata, for example, to flip, what is it, every 60,000 years on average. When you actually have magnetism, you have these different attributional states where you have torque. It's no different than gyroscopic torque. This is a low friction. It's made in England, a low friction brass and aluminum gyroscope. It'll actually start to precess after you spin it up, and it'll precess more and more. And if it's on a glass surface, not this carpeted surface on this table, it will flip over, literally. And it will flip over again if it's super low friction, which this one's low friction, but not incredibly low friction. But everything in nature is divinely simple. There is not poles on a magnet, because you can't separate them out. Even in this book, first published, I think it was 1867, they understood, like, when you would cut a bar magnet in each little piece as a new magnet. I mean, if a magnet actually had poles, you'd be able to slice it right down the middle, and now there's the North Pole over here, and over here's the South Pole, but it's completely impossible. So, whoops, I hit my computer. What we have here, of course, is a pressure mediation of that thing which human beings call polarity, which is completely and wholly unreal. Gravity, of course, is just this dielectric torsion, which accelerates towards the ground. Bodies, by the way, do not accelerate towards one another. They accelerate towards the null pressure point between both. A ground, in the case of an energy circuit, being an electrical circuit, or in the case of magnetism, because magnetism and dielectricity that make up the field are a circuit, and the ground is that neat little line that you see underneath the magnetic viewing film called the plane of inertia. Plane of inertia is just another fancy word for counter space. A ground, and in fact counter space is really kind of a ridiculous word, but a ground is just a name for counter space. We grew up being told and believing that lightning struck from cloud to ground. Yeah. The accurate representation, and it does ground itself, a certain portion, but the vast majority of a lightning strike actually terminates in counter space. It is literally a desaturation of the dielectric torsion in the case of the lightning strike, which is not a strike. It is wanting to terminate itself out in a ground, but everybody thinks, well, that's where lightning hit over there, that's the ground point. That's where some of the energy was grounded, but most of the energy was actually grounded in counter space. We have high-speed photography now. We can actually see that these dendritic patterns exist. This is the lowest pressure mediation of the discharge of a massive amount of energy. It's the same dendritic pattern you actually see emanating off of a Tesla coil. I don't know if you've actually seen like a 1,000,000 volt or 2,000,000 volt Tesla coil. You see the dendritic emissions of the discharge. Torsion builds up, and the accurate representation, by the way, of an electron, which does not exist, the so-called discoverer of saying, the actual discoverer of saying, J.J. Thomson, he called it 1 unit of dielectric induction. So the grounding of 1 unit of dielectric induction, i.e. the so-called electron, is lost in counter space. The answer for the dendritic pattern that we actually see in lightning and a discharge off of a Tesla coil becomes abundantly simple. Yeah, that was Deschanel's book and talking about magnetic polarity. Even he said, and they knew back then, he was just parroting what he was told from Faraday and others, that neither one of these polarities can exist apart from one another. If they can't exist, it's like saying the head side of a coin can exist from the tail side of a coin. Well, they can't exist apart from one another. If they can't exist apart from one another, then a duality in nature is impossible, which is exactly what I've been saying for years. There are no dualities in nature. There's principle and attribute. This thing of the ancient Pythagoreans and who knows before them, called emanationism in English. And amazingly enough, there's no book on emanationism. There's one that's kind of close by A.H. Armstrong. And he's one of the translators of Plotinus's Enneads. Absolutely horrific. He was a Christian, which I don't fault him for being a Christian, but in his very book, he says he doesn't understand it. And that's the only book that's ever been written. Before I kick the bucket, whenever that is, 5 years, 10 years, who knows when, I will have completed a book on emanationism, because there isn't one out there. You have to pull from countless sources, fragments of Proclus, Iamblichus, Plotinus, the oracles at Delphi, translated by Thomas Taylor. Those fragments, they're scattered throughout history, here and there and everywhere, and you have to know where to look and spend years looking for it. But being able to answer what emanation is actually extremely simple. Light and illumination, of course, are a circuit, principle, and attribute. So too is self and ignorance. What's the distinction between dielectricity and magnetism, light and illumination, electricity, because electricity is a circuit. Electricity is 5 times psi equals Q in Planck of electrification and is an electrical circuit. If you actually understand that electricity, once again, is a hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism operating in conjunction as a complete circuit, then understanding what an electromagnet is becomes super, super easy and super simple. Self and ignorance. When we have light, we have illumination. No one, by the way, interestingly enough, has ever seen light. People have only ever seen illumination. Light is the principle. Illumination is what people see, not light. If I told you what light looked like, and you'd have to conceive it in your head, it might pop the cork in your brain, but that's a matter for another video. It is very, very simple. A circuit, by definition, is modulation. Ignorance is modulation. Magnetism is modulation. It actually has an average frequency, which is like 42 megahertz. The geomagnetic precession of the three-dimensional force vector that defines magnetism. Illumination is modulation. Isn't it the case that illumination has a circuit? What this radio receives is nothing other than non-visible light illumination. All radio, gamma, X-ray, visible light, infrared, all of that is EMR, electromagnetic radiation.
Precipitation is forecast to be below normal.
Bhava is modulation. The ancients knew what this was, even though they didn't have all these scientific instruments that we have now. The passage, Bhava Nirodha Nibbandham, the subjugation of becoming, is the definition for nirvana. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the subjugation of chitta, i.e. nous or spiritus sanctum modulations, means liberation. The ultimate goal, of course, of yoga is liberation. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the subjugation of modulation, is liberation. Vritti, modulation. Bhava, becoming, is modulation. The ancients in ancient Pali called the moon Attabha, the king of Attabhava, of self-becoming. Not this psychophysical self, but the transcendent self. And the reason why they said that is the moon is perpetually going through waxing and waning phases, obviously so. But they understood this the same as well. Principle and attribute, light and illumination, frequency. Frequency is not a thing. Frequency is no different than saying waves. There's no such thing as waves. Waves are not things, rather what things do, which of course I've said that like how many millions of times? Waves, bhava, vritti, frequency, magnetism, illumination. These are all of these things are exactly the same thing. Not things themselves, rather what things are doing in activity. This is one of the cornerstones of understanding the ancient lost principle of the Pythagoreans, and who knows before them, of the Platonists, the Neoplatonists, this principle of emanationism. Totally the opposite of nihilism/atomism, totally the opposite of first cause, original sin, yada, 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 of the creationists, of all creationists, as a cornerstone of all creationism which cannot be questioned. First sin, original cause, Eve, the great sin, it goes by a lot of different names. That's undeniable in any translation. So emanationism is completely the opposite of both those things. And both of those things are the head side of the coin and the tail side, and these people have been arguing, going back and forth for a gazillion years, since the dawn of time. And wisdom, i.e. emanationism, is right in the center. That is the silver, or the gold, the medium. In this case, the medium is the ether. All fields are ether perturbation modalities. Over here we got magnetism, and over here we got dielectricity or electricity. No, nature doesn't work that way. There are no dualities in the muddy feet, hairy armpit, shoeless, hippie chick that is nature. It cannot exist that way. It breaks the premise of Occam's razor. It breaks the simplicity and divinity of natura naturans, which is just a fancy way of saying Mother Nature. It helps you explain what electricity is, what a circuit is. Helps you understand light and illumination, principle and attribute. Shadow is an absence of something. In ignorance, avidya, transcendental ignorance, i.e. pre-embodiment ignorance, i.e. metaphysical ignorance, is what? Isn't that a modulation? Yoga chitta vritti nirodha, bhava nirodha nibbandham. Everything can be understood in the terms of principle and attribute. The essence of what something is, like light, and what we know it for. Illumination, becoming, frequency, disturbance, modulation. The circuit, which is trying to complete itself. Understanding nature is extremely simple. It's all of this garbage that's out there that confuses people's brains with trash and nonsense and atomism and all sorts of illogical, irrational hokum. It confuses people. People throw up their hands in disgust. It really is very easy to understand. But you have to have a clarity of insight, which most people unfortunately lack. But anybody could have it, but you have to think in a way that is free from the encumbrances of the piles of stupidity and nonsense that you were taught and I was taught, yada, yada, yada. The brainwashing filth that they tried to fill your head with in school. I hope you liked this video. If you'd like me to go further into depth on this topic, I gladly will. I don't want to bore you to death. Try to keep it simple. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to contact me or any donation, check out the description below. Send me an email if you need to, and have a good day.